This is the Marketing Podcast Network.
Stories influence, teach, and inspire us. But what about the storytellers who create them? Uncorking a Story profiles storytellers to uncover how their background and life experiences influence the stories they create. We learn what motivates them, their path to success, and what fuels them to keep creating. It all starts by asking one simple question: where does your story begin? Welcome to Uncorking a Story. Now here's your host, Mike Carlin.
Well, hello and welcome to Uncorking a Story. I'm your host, Mike Carlin, and today I'm excited to introduce you to Edward Carey. Edward is a novelist, visual artist, and playwright. His previous novels include The Swallowed Man, which was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, Little, Alva Irva, and Observatory Mansions. He joins me today on Uncorking a Story to talk about his latest novel, Edith Holler. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Edward.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for having me.
Edward, I'm happy to have you here. I do believe our conversation will be timely given our given the time of year when we're recording this. But before we jump into your latest work, I'm curious, where does your story as a writer begin?
I suppose I was always drawing as a kid, like many kids, and I sort of drew all over the place, drew on the house, and drew all the time. And I started originally kind of copying cartoon characters like Asterix and Obelix, who were my big heroes when I was a kid. And then I started drawing my own characters, and that's never really left me. I always have an element of art in my work, and so I think that's where it started. And then I was fascinated by theatre. I love theatre, and I worked as a playwright. But then I became a novelist, I think, because of one novel. Well, actually, because of two novels. So the first novel, when I was about 8, at school, the master gave us a book called The Weird Stone of Brisingamen by Alan Garner. Alan Garner is a sort of wizard of English children's fiction. He's just extraordinary. Nobody is like him at all. And I read this book, and I fell in love with it in such a way, when you read those books that mean more to you than anything else. And this hit me at about the age of 8, and I had such a passion for it. I still go back and read that book very often, and it's set in an actual place on the border between England and Wales, in Cheshire, a place called Alderley Edge. I've never been there, and yet I feel I know it absolutely. And I so fell in love with that book that I wanted to do something like that. So when you got so excited by a world, that seemed to me that the most amazing thing. I sort of carried that with me as a great feeling. Then for years and years and years, did sort of other things. But when I was a playwright, I didn't read very much fiction. I'd sort of got out of the habit. And one day in a bookstore, I picked up Gunter Grass's The Tin Drum, and the voice of Oscar Matzerath, Die Kleine Oscar, was so astounding, was so amazing. I thought, oh my God, I want to do that. That was, and also Gunter Grass illustrates his own work to an extent. And I was so excited by then the possibilities of fiction, because in theatre, you're limited by practical things, but as a writer of fiction, you can go anywhere. I think it is actually true magic. You can do anything. It's just you and a page, and you can have an enormous budget. You can have worlds. You can have fantastic creatures, dragons. You can have a cast of millions or of one, and the budget's the same.
Yeah.
It's just you and the page.
Yeah, you don't have to worry about all those practical issues, such as, set decorations and how to.
As a playwright, I can afford, probably about 2.5 actors.
You said, magic, writing fiction can be magical. I think, artists are magical. I mean, that is the ability to create an image in your mind and then transfer it to the page, to me, is a superpower. I mean, I don't have. I was scared to death of art class when I was a kid. The only thing maybe more intimidating than art class to me could have been gym class. I'm
with you on that one.
But I mean, but I love, you have both, right? I mean, you can, create a story and then you can illustrate it. You could illustrate the characters. Is the illustration of characters, important to you when you're writing fiction? I mean, just kind of having a really clear sense of what they look like.
Yeah, it is entirely essential. I feel if I can't see my characters physically and physically fully understand them, then I don't know them. And so right at the beginning of the process, I will draw the characters. And I've done this always since I've made any sort of fiction, whether for theater or pure solid fiction in novels. I have to do it. I need to know them. I need to understand them physically. And I think part of the stress on the physical is because of having a theater background, but it's also as an English person, we are given as a sort of medicine, Charles Dickens. And it's like cod liver oil. Some people like it, some people absolutely loathe it. I loved it. I loved his exaggeration. I loved seeing those figures, and the world came alive to me, and that's something very exciting. So for me, for each of my books, I try and do something different in terms of creating art. So for my second book, I made a piece of sculpture of the principal characters in a miniature city. So I made the city in 3D. For my first book, I just did sort of prints. That was the least artistically sort of ambitious project, but more and more, I wanted it to become part of the fabric of what I was writing. So I wrote this novel that took me 15 years to write, which is far, far too long, called Little, which is about Madame Tussaud of Waxworks fame. And that novel is full of illustrations that I say are by her. So they're her illustrations. So they say something more about the character. But I also, to understand her profession of making wax, I made wax death mask. And I needed to understand what that felt like to work with wax and to have wax with you. So I always wrote with a block of beeswax while I was writing. But for me, I need to, if I can't physically see them, I don't know them.
Yeah. And then I imagine it helps your readers understand, these characters more too. The more you can explain them and the more you can really, because I know for me in my earlier work, a lot of editors would criticize it, but like, you know what, good story, but we don't know what your characters look like. We don't have so you haven't described them well. The ability to draw them, I imagine, helps you with translating that vision to a written description.
Yeah, and I teach creative writing here at the University of Texas at Austin. And one of the things I'm frequently telling my undergraduate students is we need to have less floating heads so that they have these characters that, they're, amazing writers, my students, but often they forget that physicality, not all the time, but I think, but at the moment, it's so exciting, that physical, when you physically understand them. And so I guess my characters are often grotesques. Not always, probably not. The principal characters will probably be something like a coat hanger on which the grotesques can be sort of laid over. But yeah, for that physical, that makes me happy if I know them, and then I can see them. And then they become a presence to me. For the novel about Madame Tussaud, I also carved a fully articulated wooden doll of Madame Tussaud, which is the exact size of the woman. And she sits at home with us, this wooden woman, and my wife had a haircut so she could have some hair. But I think, the other thing about writing is that I think you have to be obsessed by your material. And this is one way for me to get really close to it.
Yeah, because if you're not obsessed by that material, if you're not putting that energy and thought into it, your reader's not going to be obsessed by your material either, right?
Right. Yeah.
Tell me about taking 15 years to write that book, because that is a long time. I imagine if it took you 15 years to write a play, you might get into a little bit of trouble. But why was that? Why did that book take so long?
Because it's the one book that I have written that was based on a real person, and Madame Tussauds life was extraordinary, and she knew all the most extraordinary people in her period of history. She was in France during the French Revolution. She knew, or claimed she knew, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, Robespierre, Danton, Benjamin Franklin, Voltaire. I mean, all these Rousseau, Lafayette, all these extraordinarily famous people, Napoleon, and enormous people. And I had to, I overdid the research, and I couldn't find a way into it, the novel, and research is great, but you can also drown in it, and then it can be quite dangerous. And of course, many people have written about the French Revolution, and I couldn't find my right path with the material to begin with, and so I'd done this a draft of the book, and I hated it, and so I abandoned it, and I thought I would never go back to it ever again, and that was the best thing I could possibly do for the book, is go to hell with you. And then I wrote a trilogy very quickly, straight afterwards, with great joy, and the trilogy came out like a blessing. It was just like, hey, here I am. And when I was finishing the third volume of the trilogy, I suddenly thought, because I've got this wooden woman at home, and so she was there, the presence of the figure was always about me, and I just thought, oh, all right, I'll read it. And of course, it's so often true. If you leave something alone, a piece of writing, for a while and come back to it, you'll see it with a great new clarity. And I suddenly understood what I'd done wrong with the novel. And the problem was I'd made the principal character, the narrator, Marie Groschholz, who becomes Madame Tussauds, I'd made her uncanny, and that was putting a massive distance between the reader and the material. And seeing that so clearly, I suddenly knew how to fix it. And then I could go back to it and finish it.
Right. That's a great lesson in there, though, giving something some time to just rest, giving your mind, your subconscious some time to rest, and then coming back to it later. I love that notion of coming back to it with more clarity. I'm curious.
Yeah, Hilary Mantel. I was just reading to my students, the great historical writer Hilary Mantel, saying that when you have an idea, it's not necessarily the time for you to see it through.
That's true. And I think the universe will tell you that as well.
Right.
In terms of, writing plays and writing novels, do you get a different satisfaction from each?
Well, I've worked less in theatre lately because here I am as a teacher as well, and with complications, and the theatre life in Austin is not as active as it might be. But yes, you do have a kind of complete difference, and you also, as a playwright, you have to surrender your material to other people, and they can do wonderful things with it, or you may disagree with them. With a novel, of course, your editor will help you, but hopefully you'll agree with that person. You retain strong control of the material, and that makes one sound as if a kind of control freak. But I think there's something that, with fiction, it's yours, it's personal, it's there. Of course, theatre is as well. And I have to say, there's nothing, when you see a really magnificent piece of theatre, there's nothing better than it. I mean, it's so exciting. The business of it being live seems, again, magical, seems so rare, so extraordinary. If you catch, like the great actor Michael Gambon died a couple of weeks ago, and I remember seeing him in the West End in London multiple times and just following an actor doing extraordinary things. So, yes, different things. One, of course, one misses desperately about theatre is human beings, because when you're sat on your own, oh God, here it's you again, we're back to work, endlessly just yourself. There is that difference, that community that you can have in theatre can be astounding.
Yeah, and I imagine I hear what you're saying with having, complete control over it. But when in theater, when you write a line of dialogue, you get to hear it being performed, and you get to also understand what the audience reactions are, and then you can decide whether or not you need to tweak it. I don't know how often you edit something after it's been published in play form, but I can speak from I write a lot of comedy, and I'll also perform stand-up comedy, and I'll know if something doesn't work like right away. And then I know how to tweak the joke. And, Jerry Seinfeld is notorious for, writing and editing and writing and editing until that joke is like perfect. Do you follow a similar process with when you're, writing for the stage or no?
Yeah, you really only know if a play works when it's in front of an audience. And that's a terrifying and exhilarating thing. And with novel writing, it's different, of course. But I always read my work aloud. It's incredibly important, and I perform it quite dramatically when I have readings. But yes, ideally, when you're working on a play, you're reading it. That you go to that first read through, or you have versions of it that you read first, and even then, you're hearing it. You're trying to work out what's right, what's wrong, and how to compress it, and how it moves forward. And you can only do that. You have to have witnesses to it.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Edith Holler. What can you share with us about your latest?
Edith Holler is a novel I wrote during the pandemic. I was working on another book, which I had to put aside during those kind of bleak days, and then I got a sort of book by mistake out of it as well, because I didn't, of course, none of us knew how long it was going to last. I said I was going to do a drawing a day until it was over. And so I drew and put on social media a drawing a day for 500 days, which was kind of exhausting, but it was wonderful putting that in. But at the same time, I was writing this novel. And this novel is, we've talked about theatre already. It was born out of a love of theatre. I miss theatre desperately. Of course, there was no theatre going on in the pandemic. And I spent the pandemic in Austin, Texas. And as you can hear from my lousy Texan accent, I'm not from here. And I miss England desperately too. And I come from the east of England. I grew up in a village near the city of Norwich, and I miss Norwich. Norwich was like this extraordinary thing for me, and I wanted to write about Norwich and the theatre. And I was also thinking about, during the pandemic, we all had to imagine things. We had to imagine ourselves in new places. We had to go on grand tours as if it was, like old-fashioned grand tours of Europe while walking around our sitting room. We had to find ways of traveling. And I thought I would set this novel's principal character as a young woman who cannot leave the theatre. She's stuck in it because her father is something of a bully, and he has convinced her that she's cursed, that she can't go out. I mean, he's somewhat terrifying, but then he does this to create an audience. People come to see the child who can't leave the theatre. And she's not allowed to talk. She walks with ash around the theatre, and people think they're seeing a ghost. They think they're seeing this supernatural thing, and we don't know whether it's true or not. But this child, who's never left the theatre, knows only the theatre. So she thinks in terms of stories. She thinks in terms of plays. She's almost a fantastical character. And she's obsessed by the city that she can't go out in. And us in COVID, we couldn't go out anywhere. And so she travels by having other people in the theatre bring her books about Norwich, and she suddenly discovers everything about the city. And in it, she discovers a terrible truth. She discovers this extraordinary crime that's been going on in the city. And she decides the only way, she wants to tell people about it, but she's not allowed to talk in front of the people of Norwich. And so she writes a play in which she reveals what has happened. to this beloved city of her, and it's really unpleasant. And this sets off the chain of events that happens in the novel.
Wow. So I'm curious, you're writing this during the pandemic. You said you had to stop writing something else. Was that because this idea came to you and you felt that you needed to write it? Or was something else going on where you had to shelve the other work?
I think that the trouble with the other work, and I'm trying to get back to it now, is I wasn't quite ready for it, and I couldn't quite get it right. And I'm not sure that I'm there yet. But I've always wanted to write a novel set inside the theater. I not only did I do bits of playwriting, but I worked for theater in Lithuania and in Romania. I lived inside the theater in Romania, some big, terrifying cavern of a theater that was built during the dictatorship of Nicolae Ceausescu. I worked with a shadow puppet master in Malaysia and with puppet companies in the UK. And one of the early jobs I had after leaving university, and it was maybe the best job I ever had, was I was a stage doorkeeper of a West End theatre in London. So I had the keys to the theatre. I would bike there in the morning, as the sun was coming up, and the theatre was mine. This huge Victorian theatre was mine. I unlocked it. I walked around. Nobody else was there. The sounds the theatre made, I was obsessed with it. And I desperately wanted to write about the theatre somehow. And I thought in the pandemic, that idea of, in a theatre, you have a room, the stage, in which anything can happen. The impossible can happen. Shakespeare, for example, is calling fairies on the stage in Midsummer Night's Dream. We have the fantastical character of Ariel in The Tempest. He brings up the dead. All the dead kings are suddenly alive on stage. He says, this is a fantastic place. We'll call it Illyria. And you as an audience go, okay, that's Illyria. He's told us it is, and we believe it. And so I really wanted to create that extraordinary room of magic and the fantastic and full of live bodies performing. So then I thought, yes, this is a pandemic novel, but it's also a hymn to theatre. And the Conservative government, who I despise in the United Kingdom, were busy not giving any funding to theatre. So the actors, of course, and many other people were out of work. But they closed the theatres and they were closing libraries, and all this access to culture and to art was just sort of being destroyed. But it's the most, it's one of the most essential things of being a human being. So I wanted to write about my passion for theatre, and also write about how the young are being destroyed by the older generations.
Yeah. During the pandemic, I struggled, as many people did, with that sense of isolation and not having a lot of other human contact, except for the people who lived in my house, who it turned out didn't really want to have a lot of contact with me. But, in hindsight, I look back and I say, geez, there were some gifts that the pandemic gave us, and gifts that we didn't necessarily appreciate at the time. I think one of the gifts it gave you was the idea behind this novel, because I don't know, had you not, been, I don't want to say forced to stay in your house, but had you not, been forced to take this time away and almost, not walk away from society, but not have a lot of the same human interactions that we've had, do you think this idea would have come to you at any other time in your life?
No, probably not. No, I think, and often those things that happen by accident feel lucky and feel sort of strangely blessed. But yeah, no, the other sort of the ignition for it is that I was in London as the pandemic started, and my family was supposed to join me, and we were supposed to go up to Edinburgh for spring break, and it became, as we all remember, very quickly it was turning into something else, something that we'd never seen before. And the last interaction I was with an extraordinary, with one of the best living British illustrators called Clive Hicks Jenkins. And I'd met him because I was doing an event I'd written a piece on folklore for a British publication, and we were both working on it. Clive was doing the illustrations. I'd written one of the stories, and Clive and I were in Covent Garden. That was the last sort of bit of communication I had, having a coffee, and we talked about theatre and our passion. He'd been a dancer in his earlier days, but we also talked about toy theatres, and he makes these Victorian era toy theatres, and I think that was going through my head. Oh gosh, I remember those toy theatres. They're extraordinary, and Robert Louis Stevenson wrote an amazing essay about them, and I could see these toy theatres, and they kept going in my head. Oh wow, I could maybe illustrate a whole novel with a toy theatre, because if my protagonist, this is how it was sort of coming together in my head, the protagonist is a 12-year-old, and she would know these in a theater, and so she would make up her stories with the card characters in a toy theater. And so this is the first illustration I did for the novel. Unfortunately, it's sort of reversed, but it's her as a toy theater character. So she herself. So I could illustrate. You could cut up my novel and make a toy theater out of it. Or you don't cut up the novel, you just go to my website and you can download it and make it yourself. But so I suddenly became, yes, I wanted to, this was my clue into how to do the theatrical thing. And so I could put in backdrops showing, here, for example, is the proscenium arch that then you would cut out and make into it. There are masks throughout. Here is a mask of Edith. This is a sort of a doll of the principal villain. And suddenly it began to appear in my head. You have those moments when you're writing, when suddenly something goes forward. And it was having that conversation with Clive and thinking of Norwich and theatre. And suddenly I went, I can create a toy which would speak to the young abused woman who's writing as a first person narrative, who's writing the story and writing the play, and we could see that play as if it was a toy.
Yeah. Amazingly creative. That thank you so much for sharing that with me and with the audience. That's great. I love the backstory to that. I really do. What are some of the biggest things you've learned about yourself as a person through your writing? Whether it's writing for the stage or writing for long form fiction. What are some big insights you've gleaned into yourself?
Oh golly, I think I'm hiding from myself. I don't know. I mean, people say when you're writing, you're chasing your own demons, whether you like it or not. And so I think you can look at a writer's life and gain something of their characters, of their character rather. As an expat, living in Austin, I married an American, but she's not from Texas. She's from Massachusetts. I can't write about Texas because I'm not Texan, and I wouldn't know how to. I wouldn't presume to. So I write some of my books are set in cities that don't exist, or we go back to a Victorian past, or even further back in time. So I think kind of playing with that, I guess I've often asked myself the question about homeland and where it is you're from and what home means to you. And that was another question that would come out all the time in the pandemic. And then, and this is going to sound very cheesy, but it became clear who was home was my family, was my wife and kids, and the ghastly but beloved black cat we picked up just as the pandemic was beginning. But I don't know. Has it taught me something? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I never gave that sort of question. I mean, I don't know. You love your characters and you get obsessed by them and you put them through hell, and you have to put them through hell. Otherwise, it wouldn't be very interesting. I don't know. I can't answer that question. It's terrifying. Yeah, I mean, you do show yourself. You show yourself with precisely which stories that you pick, and with what your obsessions are.
Yeah, that's why I think writing, if people want to become successful at writing, they've got to become very comfortable with being vulnerable and vulnerability. Because even if you're writing fiction, you are leaving a bit of yourself on the page. In the pages of that book, you will reveal something about yourself, through your subconscious. I believe anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that's true, but you may want to not not admit to it as the extent of it.
Absolutely. Well, as we wrap up here, Edward, I'm curious if you could whisper something into your younger self's ear, right? I'd like to call this a dear younger me question. If you could write a letter to your younger self, what kind of advice would you give the younger Edward?
I mean, I think like all writers are probably, all artists, whatever, all human beings battle with self-confidence at times. And it took me a while to have enough confidence to marry writing and art. But I would just, be bold, be as bold as you possibly can. And be outrageous. You can do it. But I think I would, if I could tell my younger self, you would be publishing books, I think he would have been happy about that.
Yeah, I love that. Be bold. And I'm, as you say that, I hear the opening of the original Star Trek in my head. Boldly go where no one has gone before.
I was obsessed with that. It came out just the right time for me, and I was at that age. That was, amazing stuff.
Did you have a favorite Star Trek episode?
Star Wars, I did, but no, you said Star Trek. No, I did. Sorry, Star Trek. No, not so much. Star Wars is what I went behind, and I know they're the two different breeds of people: the Star Trek ones and the Star Wars ones.
Absolutely. I won't tell you which one I am.
What?
I will say this: I'm watching on Netflix. The House of Usher is one of the late things. I don't know if you've had a chance to see any of it.
But I will. I heard good things about it.
I was geeking out on it last night. I was watching the first episode with my wife last night. I was geeking out on it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, there is so much, Edgar Allan Poe symbolism throughout, but even down to the dialogue and narration, it is poetic. There's a rhythm to it. There are Easter eggs throughout. The reason I'm bringing it up, though, is, you mentioned Star Wars. Mark Hamill, Luke Skywalker himself, has a not too insignificant part in this. So it put a big smile on my face when I saw him.
Yeah. Well, he's a thoroughly decent human being by all accounts, I think. Fantastic.
Yeah. Agreed. So Edward, I'm curious. You mentioned 500 drawings. Do you have a place where these live, where people can see them?
Well, they're on my website, and I was just posting them, and I published a book of them called Plagues and Pencils. I've got a stack of them here. They're all there, and they vary hugely because it was across the breadth of the pandemic, and right now up until Halloween, and I think I've just posted drawing number 65. I am drawing every day and putting on Twitter. I refuse to call it anything else. And however long it lasts, once it becomes too soiled, I'll jump ship, I'm sure. And Instagram, daily drawings from British folklore, which is connected to my new novel. So from that, it'll be 70 plus days. I will be doing folklore drawings, and actually getting lost in the kind of wonderful worlds of different creatures, and ghosts, etc. that come from British folktales. Been a lot of fun.
Well, very good. I will be sure to put a link to your website as well as your Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook in our show notes, so people can easily look that up and see your wonderful artwork. And Edward, I will say thank you for stopping by Uncorking a Story and letting me uncork yours.
Thank you so much, Mike. This has been great.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.